By your own account, everything went very smoothly with the president yesterday. Can you give us any more details?
It was a very good meeting, and we discussed how to continue to adapt NATO to a more demanding and unpredictable security environment. And the main issue was defense spending. For many, many years, defense budgets were cut across Europe and Canada, but now we have turned a corner. All allies have started to increase defense spending, and more allies meet what we call the 2% target, spending 2% of GDP on defense. So we still have a long way to go, but European allies and Canada have started to invest more in defense. And that's important because we see more assertive Russia, and we see all the terrorism, the violence, and therefore NATO has to respond.
Reports that certain countries, particularly Germany, are having a very difficult time ramping up that spending. Germany, for example, would have to double the size of its army, and many strategists are saying that's a long way away.
So many allies have a long way to go, but the good news is that all allies have stopped the cuts and started to increase defense spending, and that's also the case for Germany. Last year, they had a real increase in defense spending of 6%, and they have announced that they will continue to increase. So I'm not underestimating the challenges, and also that some allies really have a long way to go, but at the same time it is encouraging to see the progress and that all allies are moving in the right direction, and that more and more allies have reached the 2% target. And we haven't promised to be at 2% for all allies within 1 year. What we promised was to stop the cuts, start to increase, and then move towards 2% within a decade. So we are on track, but we still have a long way to go.
Have you noticed any difference in tone from the administration? It's slightly different from the last time you visited. So now John Bolton, for example, is part of the apparatus, Mike Pompeo too?
There are some new persons, especially Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton, but the main message is the same, and that is that the United States is committed to NATO. 2 world wars and the Cold War taught us all that we are stronger together, that we need a strong transatlantic bond. That's good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States and North America. We have to remember that the only time we invoked our collective defense clause, Article 5, was after an attack on the United States, 9/11, and hundreds of thousands of European soldiers and Canadian soldiers have served shoulder to shoulder with US soldiers in Afghanistan as a direct response to an attack on the United States. And it's a great advantage for the United States to have so many friends and allies as the US has in NATO. No other big power, no other superpower has as many friends as the United States, and I think that's a great advantage for the United States.
Mr. Secretary General, you've embraced the idea that there needs to be more burden sharing and a general increase in the amount that countries offer to the NATO budget. What would be the priorities for NATO, including a big US voice, for that extra spending?
Well, the priority is to make sure that all deliver on what they promised. We need the increased investments to partly increase the readiness of our forces. We need to be able to reinforce quickly if needed. When there is more uncertainty, we need to be able to respond quickly. And therefore, we also focused on both the transatlantic, the need to be able to move forces quickly across the Atlantic Ocean, but also throughout Europe. So this is not only about investing in more troops, but also to make sure that the right troops can be in the right place at the right time. And then we're also stepping up the fight against terrorism. Not by engaging in big combat operations, but by training local forces, as we now do in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have made a lot of progress, but we have to make sure that ISIL doesn't come back. We have to finish the job, and the best way of doing that is to train local forces to enable them to stabilize their own country, instead of we being engaged in big combat operations.
And so given that, how are you as NATO Secretary General approaching the idea that the US seems to be going it alone to a certain extent on the likes of North Korea, has taken a very different stance on Iran than Europe at the moment, and various other foreign policy positions?
Well, on North Korea, there is full support from all NATO allies to the efforts of the United States to find a peaceful, negotiated solution to the crisis in North Korea. And the aim is to denuclearize North Korea, to stop the development of nuclear weapons of North Korea, and to also stop their ballistic missile program. That's important for all of us, because the missiles from North Korea can reach Europe and reach the United States. On Iran, there are differences. Because European allies, they support the Iran deal. The United States have decided to withdraw. But we all agree that it's important to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. We all agree that we are concerned about the ballistic missile program of Iran, and also the destabilizing activities that Iran is responsible for in the wider Middle East region. So we have to address the differences, but at the same time make sure that NATO stands united around our core task, and that is to protect and defend all allies. And we have proven before, when we have seen differences, that we're able to do exactly that.
If geopolitical tensions do heat up in one of those parts of the world that you just mentioned, how would NATO come to an agreement on how to approach something, whether it be on the ground or elsewhere, in order to protect itself?
Well, NATO is able to protect and defend all allies against any potential threat and any potential adversary. And we have proven for almost 70 years, since we were founded in 1949, that what we call the Terrans, the message that if one ally is attacked, the whole alliance will respond, one for all for one. That's the best way to prevent the war, because then any potential adversary knows that if they attack one ally, the whole alliance will respond, and we are by far the strongest military alliance in the world. Half of the world's military might is within NATO. So we have to provide continued credible deterrence, and that's exactly what we do when we now are strengthening our collective defense.
Are you confident, though, that should something happen with the United States, if some of these talks go wrong, are you confident that the other NATO members would advocate for defending the United States, for example?
Yes, I'm confident that all allies will defend each other, and the only time we have invoked this collective defense clause, that we stand up and defend each other in a military operation, was after 9/11 attack on the United States. And hundreds of thousands of European soldiers have been in Afghanistan fighting in a military operation that was triggered by an attack on the United States. We have proven that this solidarity is real. But when it comes to North Korea and Iran, the main focus is to prevent any military conflict, to find a peaceful solution, to find an agreement to stop the development of nuclear weapons of North Korea, and to prevent Iran for developing nuclear weapons. So the focus now is on a peaceful and negotiated solution.
Mr. Secretary General, I'm sure by July you'll want to put the talk of burden sharing and upping contributions to the side and take on something else as a topic. What's your hope for the July summit?
My hope for the July summit is that we once again show transatlantic unity. Almost 1 billion people in the NATO allied countries from both sides of the Atlantic. We have proven to be the most successful military alliance in history, because we have been able to stand together, and because we have been able to change and adapt when the world is changing. And that's exactly what we have to continue to do, and to show at our summit in July in Brussels.
Finally, Mr. Secretary General, do you have concerns that trade negotiations that involve the United States and NAFTA countries, and China in particular, will lead us down more geopolitically difficult routes?
Well, NATO is not part of trade negotiations, but of course we believe that trade is good for economic growth, but it's not for NATO to go into how to negotiate good trade agreements. But we hope that at least all NATO allies are able to agree on how to create the best framework for trade.